The transport plane touched down on the frozen airstrip like a metal bird surrendering to the Arctic wind. Snow swept across the runway in pale ribbons, and the sky above Alaska hung low and steel gray, as if the entire world had been wrapped in frost. Emma stepped down the narrow ladder from the aircraft, boots crunching against ice that had hardened over weeks of sub-zero nights. She carried only one duffel bag. Inside it were medical gloves, thermal layers, and a small silver box wrapped carefully in paper. Most people who volunteered for temporary rotations at isolated Arctic installations did so for extra pay or career points. Emma had volunteered for a different reason. 8 years of marriage. 8 anniversaries interrupted by deployments, emergency shifts, and hospital nights that never ended when the clock said they should. Her husband had been stationed at this remote radar base for months, coordinating communications for early warning systems scattered across the Northern Defense Network. He believed she wouldn't arrive for another week. That had been the plan. A surprise. A quiet one. The kind that involved a badly baked cake in the mess hall oven and a ring engraved with 8 small marks. 8 winters survived together. The cold wind cut through her jacket as she adjusted the strap of her duffel. The base stretched out ahead of her, a cluster of prefabricated steel buildings crouched low against the snow, the radar tower rising above them like a lonely needle stabbing into the gray sky. It was quiet. Too quiet. And Matt noticed that immediately. Most people saw beauty in a place like this: endless snowfields, untouched forests, the silence of wilderness. But Matt had worked long enough in emergency medicine to know something about silence. Silence was rarely peaceful. Sometimes it was simply the pause before everything went wrong. A military technician guided her across the yard toward the administrative trailer. The man barely glanced at her credentials. He just scanned the transfer orders, nodded once, and waved her inside. "Temporary nurse rotation?" he muttered. "Yeah," Emma answered simply. The technician shrugged. "Clinic's small, mostly frostbite, broken fingers, and bored soldiers doing stupid things." He slid a clipboard toward her. "Sign here." She signed. No ceremony. No introduction. Just another name passing through the system. Inside the base clinic, the smell of antiseptic mixed with reheated coffee. The small medical unit had 2 treatment beds, a supply cabinet, and a desk cluttered with paperwork. A tall doctor in a thick parka glanced up from a laptop. He didn't stand. "Transfer nurse?" he asked. Emma nodded. He studied her for half a second before returning his attention to the screen. "You're early," he said. "Flights were ahead of schedule." "Well," he said dryly, "don't expect much excitement out here." The tone carried something familiar. "This missile." Emma had heard it before. Many times. Doctors sometimes treated nurses like assistants who existed only to fetch instruments and write notes. She didn't correct him. She simply placed her bag near the wall. "Where do you need me?" The doctor sighed. "Observation ward mostly. Monitor vitals, inventory supplies." His eyes flicked toward her again. "You're new, so just follow procedures. No improvising." Emma gave a small nod. Improvising. That word almost made her smile. Across the base, a communications door slammed open. Boots pounded through snow. And suddenly a familiar voice cut through the cold air. "Huh?" She turned. Her husband stood 10 yards away near the communications trailer. For a moment he simply stared. Then his face broke into something softer than she had seen in months. He crossed the yard in long strides and wrapped his arms around her. The cold didn't matter. The wind didn't matter. For a few seconds the frozen base disappeared entirely. "You weren't supposed to be here yet," he said into her hair. She shrugged lightly. "Paperwork, miracle." He laughed. That laugh reminded her why she had come. For one small moment of normal life. He looked tired. The Arctic light revealed faint lines around his eyes, the kind that came from responsibility and too many nights managing systems that could never fail. "This place is quiet," he said, glancing around. "Quiet is good," she replied. He smiled. "You sound like someone who works in hospitals." She didn't mention the things she had noticed on the walk from the airstrip. The cracked motion sensor housing near the north fence. The satellite dish that had adjusted twice before locking into position. The fuel depot without a guard during shift change. Little things. Little weaknesses. Habits she had learned years ago. Instead, she followed him toward the mess hall. Inside, warmth filled the room. Metal tables. Plastic chairs. The smell of reheated soup. She poured herself a cup of coffee that tasted like it had been sitting on the burner since dawn. Two soldiers argued near the window. Perimeter sensors tripped again, one said. Probably wildlife, the other replied. Happened every week. Emma glanced toward the frosted glass window. Beyond it, the northern ridge rose above the valley like a frozen wall of trees and snow. Heavy snow. The kind that absorbed sound. The kind that allowed movement without footsteps being heard. Her husband sat across from her. I'm glad you came, he said quietly. She reached across the table and squeezed his hand. Me too. For a moment she considered telling him about the strange feeling that had pushed her to volunteer for this rotation. A quiet instinct. A tension she couldn't explain. But instead she smiled. I brought cake mix. He laughed again. Mess hall oven still works. Ballet. The radio in the corner crackled. Then went silent. No one noticed. Outside, the wind shifted slightly. The temperature dropped another degree. And far beyond the northern ridge, something moved through the snow. Professional. Coordinated. Watching. Emma lifted her coffee cup slowly. Some instincts never truly left a person. She didn't know exactly what was wrong yet. But somewhere deep in her mind, a quiet alarm had already begun to ring. The Arctic afternoon moved slowly across the frozen valley. Gray light drifted across the radar tower, and the wind whispered against the steel siding of the base buildings like distant static. Inside the mess hall, soldiers finished late lunches while the heater rattled softly in the corner. For a moment, everything felt almost normal. Emma sat across from her husband, watching the small habits she had missed during the months apart. The way he stirred his coffee twice before drinking it. The way he checked the wall clock out of instinct every few minutes. He was responsible for communication systems that connected this remote installation to a larger defense network stretching across the Arctic. If something went wrong here, alarms would ripple across half a continent. He never forgot that. You picked a good week to visit, he said. Quiet schedule. Emma smiled faintly. Quiet makes me suspicious. He chuckled. You've been in emergency medicine too long. Maybe. But her instincts rarely rested. Across the room, two signal operators continued arguing about the perimeter sensors. They tripped again last night, one said. Wind probably knocked ice loose on the fence. Wind doesn't trigger thermal sensors. Emma listened without turning her head. Little details mattered. Patterns mattered more. And something about the conversation tightened a knot in the back of her mind. Outside the frosted window, the northern ridge stood silent beneath heavy snow. The kind that muffled sound. The kind that swallowed movement. Her husband leaned forward slightly. You're thinking again, he said. I can tell. She raised an eyebrow. That obvious? Only when you get quiet. She reached for her coffee again. Just tired from travel. He nodded. But she wasn't tired. She was listening. The base had its own rhythm, generators humming, distant boots in corridors, the faint electrical buzz of radar equipment. Right now, that rhythm felt off. Like a song missing a note. The radio on the wall crackled again. Stay. Then silence. One of the soldiers glanced at briefly but returned to his meal. No one else reacted. Outside, the wind shifted again. Emma felt the pressure change before she consciously noticed the temperature drop. Her training had taught her to read environments the way doctors read vital signs. The valley felt tense. Like something holding its breath. Her husband squeezed her hand across the table. I really am glad you came. She smiled. So am I. And then the ground shook. It wasn't a dramatic movie explosion. Not at first. Just a deep, heavy concussion that rattled trays off tables and sent a vibration through the floor like the earth itself had been struck. Everyone froze. For half a second the mess hall held perfect silence. Then the alarm screamed. Not the calm, rhythmic tone used during drills. This was harsher. Urzev. Real. Her husband was already moving. Contact, someone shouted over the radio. The second explosion hit the north perimeter. This one was louder. Windows rattled. Dust fell from the ceiling panels. Outside, smoke rose beyond the fence line. Emma and her husband burst through the mess hall door into chaos. Snow swirled through the yard, mixing with smoke from the damaged perimeter. Gunfire cracked from the northern ridge. Short bursts. Disciplined. Controlled. Not random shooting. Not panic. Professional operators. Emma recognized the pattern immediately. Soldiers sprinted for defensive positions while alarms echoed across the frozen valley. North fence breached, someone yelled. 2 security troops lay near the outer barrier. One crawled across the snow, leaving a thin red trail behind him. Mortar fire whistled overhead. An explosion erupted near the motor pool, sending a wave of heat and smoke into the air as a Humvee caught fire. Her husband grabbed the radio. All units hold positions. Reinforce the east barricade. Rounds snapped through the air. Emma moved instinctively toward the wounded soldier near the barrier. She slid into the snow beside him. Gunfire cracked overhead. She ignored it. Blood soaked through the man's parka. She pressed her gloved hands against the wound. Stay with me, she said calmly. The soldier nodded weakly. Behind her, soldiers returned fire toward the ridge. The attackers had taken high ground. Tamar calculated. Her husband moved across the yard shouting orders into the radio. Push them back from the fence. Another shot cracked across the valley. Deflet. Tarur. Emma heard it before she understood it. Her husband staggered mid-sentence. His legs collapsed beneath him. For a split second the world slowed. He hit the snow hard. Emma was already moving. She slid beside him, hands searching for the wound. Blood spread rapidly beneath his thigh. High entry wound. Upper leg. Sniper round. The blood was bright. Too bright. Arterial. She pressed her hand against the wound instantly. Warm blood soaked through her gloves. Stay with me, she said firmly. He tried to speak, but pain stole the words. She pulled a tourniquet from her medical pouch. High and tight. Twist. Twist again. The bleeding slowed. Not enough. But enough to buy time. A young medic dropped beside her. Eyes wide. Shake him. She handed him a clam. You hold pressure here, she ordered sharply. Do not let go. He nodded quickly. Her husband gripped her sleeve weakly. Hold the line, he whispered. Even now. Even bleeding into the snow. He was thinking about the base. She stood slowly. The battlefield unfolded around her. Gunfire from 3 primary firing points on the ridge. Overlapping angles. Suppression fire keeping defenders pinned behind barriers. Mortar team adjusting range. This wasn't a random attack. This was coordinated. Professional. The attackers knew exactly where to strike. The base was losing ground. If the defenders collapsed inward, mortar fire would destroy the central structures within minutes. Her eyes drifted toward the armory container near the communications shed. Inside it sat training rifles used for perimeter overwatch drills. A familiar calm began spreading through her chest. A feeling she hadn't allowed herself to experience in 10 years. Snow whipped across the yard. Radios crackled with static. Comms were failing. Reinforcements would take time. Time they didn't have. Her husband lay on a stretcher now, pale but conscious. The medic worked desperately to stabilize him. Emma turned toward the armory. A soldier grabbed her arm. Ma'am, you need to stay in the medical station. She pulled free gently. No. She walked into the armory. Steel walls echoed with distant explosions. An M110 sniper rifle rested on the rack. Partially disassembled. Training configuration. Her hands moved automatically. Mold check. Chamber clear. Scope mount. Tighten screws. Load magazine. A young sergeant stared at her. Ma'am, that rifle isn't issued to medical staff. She slung it across her shoulder. Where are you going? He asked. She paused at the door. Snow and gunfire filled the valley outside. Buying you time, she said. Then she stepped into the storm. Bullets cracked across the snow behind her as she sprinted toward the southern ridge. The attackers expected resistance from the base. They did not expect it from above. The climb was brutal. Ice forced her onto hands and knees. Wind clawed at her jacket. But halfway up the ridge she found a narrow rock shelf overlooking the battlefield. She dropped prone, cleared snow from the rifle, and looked through the scope. The northern ridge snapped into sharp focus. There, high overwatch gunner behind fallen timber. Range roughly 600 yards. Wind drift 15 miles per hour. Temperature drop affecting bullet drop. The calculations came back instantly, like they had never left. She exhaled slowly. Below her, the base teetered on the edge of collapse. Her husband was being carried toward the aid station. Soldiers were pinned behind concrete barriers. Another mortar round landed near the fuel depot. The base wouldn't hold much longer. Emma steadied the rifle. Crosshair centered on the overwatch gunner. She watched his firing rhythm. 7 rounds. Hot. Barrel adjustment. She took the slack out of the trigger. The rifle cracked across the frozen valley, and the entire battle shifted. The overwatch gunner collapsed instantly. For a brief moment, the attackers didn't realize what had happened. Then their suppression pattern faltered. Below, soldiers lifted their heads for the first time since the ambush began. Someone shouted, "They're off tempo." Emma worked the bolts calmly, her breathing steady, her mind quiet. She found the second target and squeezed the trigger again. The man dropped mid-step. Confusion rippled across the enemy line. Coordination began to collapse. The ambush had just lost its spine, and the rookie nurse lying in the snow was only getting started. The rifle report disappeared quickly into the Arctic wind. Down below, confusion spread across the attackers' line like cracks spreading through ice. For the first time since the ambush began, the defenders on the base perimeter lifted their heads. The relentless suppression fire had broken. Not completely. Not enough to breathe. Enough to move. Emma didn't feel triumph. She felt silence. The kind of silence that existed only inside a sniper's mind, the world reduced to brief crosshair, distance, and consequence. Her fingers moved with calm precision as she cycled the bolt. Metal clicked softly beneath her glove. Through the scope, the battlefield sharpened. The second man she had dropped lay half buried in fresh snow. His rifle rested beside him, barrel tilted uselessly toward the sky. The rest of the attackers were shifting now, trying to locate her. But they didn't know where to look. The southern ridge sat lower than the northern firing positions. They hadn't considered it a threat. That mistake had cost them their overwatch. Emma shifted 10 feet along a rocky shelf, flattening her silhouette against the snow. Snowflakes swirled across the scope lens, briefly blurring the view before wind cleared them again. Moment. Third target. A radio operator kneeling near the fallen leader, reaching for a handset that had dropped into the snow. He was trying to re-establish coordination. She adjusted the crosshair. Wind drift slightly stronger now. She compensated without thinking. Her breathing slowed, then stopped. The rifle cracked again. The man collapsed instantly, the radio sliding from his hand into the snow. Below the ridge, the attack fractured. What had once been a precise, synchronized assault began dissolving into scattered bursts of gunfire. Down in the base yard, soldiers felt the shift. The defenders surged forward instinctively, reclaiming ground they had lost minutes earlier. A squad pushed toward the damaged fence. Another team dragged wounded personnel toward the aid station. Through the chaos, Emma heard her husband's voice crackle across a handheld radio. Push east, controlled advance. Even on a stretcher, he was directing the defense. A faint warmth flickered inside her chest. That He was still thinking. Still fighting. The attackers now understood something had changed. Gunfire began snapping toward the southern ridge. Wild shots. The SS. Snow kicked up several yards from Emma's position. None close enough to matter. They knew the direction now, but not the exact angle. She slid another few feet along the rock shelf. Careful. Measure. Never predictable. That unpredictability was a weapon as powerful as the rifle itself. Her scope found movement again. Fourth target. Lower slope. Two figures crouched beside a mortar tube. They were adjusting the weapon's angle, trying to reorient the strikes toward the center of the base. If they fired successfully now, the aid station would be directly in the blast radius. She exhaled slowly. The world narrowed. Crosshair. Distance. Wind. One controlled trigger press. The bullet shattered the mortar's sight assembly. Glass exploded outward. The crew scattered instantly. One man dropped to the ground. The other scrambled for cover behind a tree. She didn't chase him. That was the difference between panic shooting and professional marksmanship. Every bullet had purpose. Every target had consequence. Below her, the base perimeter was stabilizing. Soldiers advanced in pairs, covering each other as they reclaimed sections of the damaged fence. A young corporal reached the outer barrier and raised his fists. Signal for partial perimeter secured. The attackers began retreating. It started slowly. A shift in posture. A hesitation between bursts of gunfire. Then a full withdrawal toward the far ridge crest. Through the scope, Emma saw snow camouflage vehicles waiting beyond the tree line. Extraction. The surviving attackers were pulling back, dragging wounded with them, abandoning equipment they couldn't recover without exposing themselves. She allowed two of them to escape deliberately. Stories spread faster than corpses. Fear traveled even faster. She remained prone for another full minute. Scanning. Watching for deception. Counter-sniper attempts. Nothing. Just distant engines fading into the frozen horizon. Finally, she lowered the rifle. The adrenaline drained from her muscles all at once. Her legs trembled slightly as she stood. The climb down the ridge felt longer than the climb up. When she reached the base yard again, the chaos had softened into controlled urgency. Smoke still curled from the motor pool, but the screaming had stopped. Soldiers moved with purpose now. Trio. Equipment checks. Casualty counts. A few of them looked at her as she walked past. Not with admiration. Not yet. Mostly confusion. She handed the rifle back to the same sergeant from the armory. He stared at it like it had just returned from another planet. Then she continued straight to the aid station. Inside, the air smelled of antiseptic and blood. Her husband lay on a treatment table surrounded by two base surgeons and a pair of medics. His face was pale. Sweat beaded along his forehead despite the cold. Emma stepped beside the table and examined the wound quickly. The damage was severe. The femoral artery had been shredded by the sniper round. One surgeon looked up. "We're stabilizing him for evacuation." She nodded quietly. But she already knew the truth. The leg wouldn't survive. The tissue damage was too extensive. Cold exposure would make reconstruction impossible. She didn't say that aloud. Instead, she adjusted a clamp, tightened a bandage, and stepped back so the surgeons could continue. Outside, the sound of approaching helicopters rolled across the valley. Whoa! How powerful! Reinforcements! The Navy helicopters arrived like thunder against the pale sky. Rotor wash blasted snow across the base yard as they descended. Gray aircraft touched down one by one. Their doors slid open, and Navy SEAL teams poured out into the frozen air. They expected chaos. They expected a failing outpost. Instead, they found a perimeter holding steady. 7 enemy bodies scattered across the northern ridge. Drone feeds confirming precise, long-range eliminations. The SEAL operators moved through the yard scanning for threats. One of the team leaders stopped abruptly. Not because of the bodies. A cut of her? A man knelt beside a wounded soldier near the aid station, stitching a deep laceration across his shoulder. Her hands moved calmly. Efficient. Precise. The SEAL leader studied her posture. The way she shifted between patients. The quiet authority in her voice. The younger operator beside him frowned. What's wrong? He asked. The leader didn't answer immediately. He stared a moment longer. Recognition slowly tightened his jaw. It can't be, the younger man muttered. The leader spoke softly. Yes? Emma finished tying the final stitch and handed the soldier off to a medic. Only then did she stand. The SEAL leader approached her slowly, helmet tucked beneath one arm. Snow gathered along the seams of his uniform. He didn't greet her like a civilian nurse. He didn't greet her at all. He simply studied her face. Older now. More lines around the eyes. But unmistakable. For a moment neither of them spoke. Then the younger operator behind him whispered something. 2 words. Quiet. Almost reverent. Air medic. The name moved through the SEAL team like a shockwave. Some of them stiffened. Others stared openly. Legends weren't supposed to appear in frozen radar outposts. Matt didn't react. She simply turned back toward the wounded soldier she had been treating. Like the name meant nothing. Like she had never heard it before. But across the yard, her husband lay on the evacuation stretcher. Watching. Confused. Because in 8 years of marriage, he had never heard that name either. The helicopters didn't shut down immediately. Their rotors kept beating the Arctic air into violent spirals, lifting snow into ghostly clouds that drifted across the yard. The sound was constant, heavy, like distant thunder refusing to fade. Emma stood outside the aid station, stripping the blood-stained gloves from her hands. Her fingers were red from cold and pressure. Across the yard, Navy SEAL operators spread out methodically, clearing structures and confirming what the drones had already reported. 7 enemy operators down. Overwatch positions neutralized. The base intact. That was not what they had expected to find when they landed. The SEAL team leader continued watching her. He approached slowly, not like someone meeting a civilian nurse. More like someone approaching an old memory he hadn't expected to see alive. He stopped a few feet away. Didn't expect to see you here, he said quietly. Ahmad didn't answer immediately. Snow brushed against the hem of her jacket as the wind shifted. Didn't expect to be here, she replied. Behind him, a younger SEAL operator stood with arms folded, studying her carefully. You were declared gone, he said. The team leader shot him a sharp look. Not here. The younger man stepped back, but his curiosity burned through his silence. Emma folded her arms loosely, conserving warmth more than showing any kind of defensive posture. Your timing was good, she said. The leader glanced toward the northern ridge. Your timing was better. He nodded once toward the hillside. 7 confirmed. She didn't react. Instead, she asked quietly, You got my message? His brow furrowed. What message? She tilted her head toward the valley road beyond the ridge. I left 2 alive. For a second he stared at her. Then understanding settled into his eyes. 2 survivors meant intelligence. Interrogation. Information about who had ordered the attack. The team leader exhaled slowly. You were always thinking 3 steps ahead. They walked a few steps away from the main yard toward the damaged communications trailer. Broken antenna panels hung like torn metal skin from the structure. The younger SEAL lingered nearby pretending to check equipment. But his ears were clearly tuned to every word. You disappeared, the leader said quietly. That was the point. You don't just walk away from what you were. She met his gaze calmly. I didn't. The past hovered between them like frost. Old battlefields. Desert heat. Night operations under gunfire. Makeshift surgical tables under dim lamps. Things neither of them spoke aloud. You still shoot the same, he said finally. It wasn't admiration. It was observation. I shoot when I have to, she answered. A small lie. She had known exactly what would happen when she picked up that rifle. And she had not hesitated. Behind them, Base personnel gathered around a drone tablet, replaying overhead footage of the battle. Whispers moved through the small crowd. Someone zoomed in on the silhouette of a single figure lying prone on the southern ridge. The angle, the stillness, the controlled movements between shots. Even the soldiers who had been pinned behind the barricades were beginning to understand what had happened. The younger SEAL muttered under his breath, 7 shots, 7 hits. Emma heard it. She always heard everything. They're going to start asking questions, the leader warned quietly. They won't get answers. You think that's still your choice? She glanced toward the valley road again. It always was. He studied her for a long moment, then nodded. Some things never change. The younger SEAL finally stepped forward. Sir, with respect that kill grouping on the ridge. The leader cut him off. That. But curiosity burned too strong. The younger operator looked at Ahmad directly. Were you trained by someone who believed in patience over speed? Ahmad tilted her head slightly. You shift your stance before speaking, she said calmly. Your instructor drilled discipline into you. The younger SEAL blinked. How do you? The team leader chuckled quietly. She hasn't lost it. The younger man swallowed. Man is a tree you used to perform surgeries while under sniper cover. Silence fell like fresh snow. Ahmad could have denied it. Could have laughed. Could have brushed the question away. Instead, she said nothing. And the silence answered everything. Before the conversation could continue, a corporal ran toward them. Duh! He held up a tablet displaying the drone feed. The thermal camera flickered across the frozen ridge beyond the valley. 3 heat signatures appeared. Moving? The SEAL leader grabbed the tablet. They left the rear element. The younger operator cursed under his breath. The base had already begun relaxing. Rifles lowered slightly. Perimeter teams were positioning after the initial attack. If those 3 operators reached a firing position now, the second wave could be worse than the first. Ahmad didn't wait for orders. She walked back toward the armory container and lifted the rifle she had leaned against the wall earlier. The team leader followed her. This time he didn't try to stop her. They climbed the southern ridge together. Snow crunched beneath their boots. Cold air burned in their lungs. But Ahmad didn't rush. Running wasted oxygen in Arctic temperatures. Measured steps. Steady breathing. Professional patience. Halfway up the ridge she dropped prone again. The SEAL leader knelt beside her with binoculars. Through the scope, the 3 heat signatures became clearer. 1 man lying prone. 1 scanning the valley with binoculars. The 3rd crouched over a compact launcher. If that launcher fired into the aid station, casualties would multiply instantly. She adjusted the scope. Wind had softened slightly. Less drift now, but also less background noise. The prone operator lifted his head. Maybe sensing something. Maybe just instinct. Ahmad entered the crosshair and squeezed the trigger. The rifle cracked. The man dropped instantly. The second operator rolled sideways, searching desperately for the shooter. Too late. She adjusted slightly. Fired again. The second man collapsed halfway through raising his rifle. The 3rd operator froze. Understanding dawning too slowly. He grabbed the launcher and tried to pivot downhill. Toward the base. Toward the wounded soldiers still being treated. For half a second, Ahmad hesitated. 2 targets neutralized. The 3rd was retreating. But she saw the angle. If he fired before escaping, the aid station would be directly in the blast radius. She pulled the trigger. The final shot echoed across the valley. Silence followed. No return fire. No movement. Just wind whispering through frozen pine trees. Ahmad remained prone for another 30 seconds. Scanning. Confirming. Nothing moved. The SEAL leader lowered his binoculars. That's it, he said quietly. She stood slowly. This time her legs felt heavier. Adrenaline fading. The weight of the day settling into her bones. When they returned to the base yard, the atmosphere had changed. The soldiers were no longer confused. They were staring. Word had already spread. Someone had stopped a coordinated assault from a sniper position on the southern ridge. Someone had saved the base. And now that someone was walking calmly back toward the aid station. Amaris. Ima ignored the attention. She stepped inside the medical building and washed the remaining blood from her hands. Outside, the SEAL leader stood watching her through the doorway. The younger operator approached him quietly. Sir, is it really her? The leader didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked back toward the ridge. 7 bodies from the first wave. 3 from the second. 10 precise eliminations. In 40 minutes. Finally, he spoke. Yes. The younger SEAL swallowed. What do we tell command? The leader looked toward the aid station again, where Ima was already tending another wounded soldier like nothing unusual had happened. He exhaled slowly. For now, he said quietly, we tell them the base held. But deep down, he knew the truth was much bigger than that, and it was only a matter of time before the entire military command structure came asking questions about the nurse they once called Iron Mech. The Arctic night arrived early. By the time the smoke from the damaged motor pool faded into the dark sky, the base had transformed into something quieter, heavier. Portable floodlights illuminated the snow-covered yard. Engineers worked to repair the broken perimeter fence. Medics moved between injured soldiers inside the small clinic. And in the command trailer, the first official investigation had already begun. Ima sat at the end of a metal table. Across from her, the base commander and 2 visiting officers from regional command reviewed drone footage on a tablet. The footage played again and again. Each replay showed the same thing. A lone figure on the southern ridge. 1 shot. Then another. Then another. 10 clean eliminations. No wasted ammunition. No hesitation. The commander rubbed his forehead. You're telling me a visiting nurse neutralized the entire assault Overwatch? One of the officers leaned back in his chair. That's what the footage shows. The commander looked directly at Ima. Did you fire those shots? Her voice was calm. Yes. The room went silent. The officer tapped the screen again. You understand that medical personnel are not authorized to engage in active combat. I understand. You violated multiple engagement protocols. I understand that too. The base commander leaned forward. You could face disciplinary action for this. Ima didn't respond. She simply folded her hands on the table. Not defensive. Not apologetic. Just calm. The commander's frustration grew. Why didn't you remain in the medical station like you were ordered? Ima looked at him evenly. Because people were going to die. The officer frowned. That wasn't your call. No, she said quietly. But it was my responsibility. Before the commander could respond, the door opened. The SEAL team leader stepped inside. Snow dusted his shoulders as he removed his gloves. Behind him stood 2 members of his team. The younger operator from earlier remained silent now, but his eyes moved between the tablet and Ima. The commander gestured impatiently. We are conducting a formal review. I know, the SEAL leader said. I'm here to clarify something. The officer folded his arms. And what exactly is that? The SEAL leader stepped closer to the table. He tapped the tablet once, freezing the drone footage on Ima's prone silhouette on the ridge. You're asking the wrong question. The officer frowned. What do you mean? You're asking why a nurse fired those shots. He looked directly at the commander. You should be asking how. The room went quiet. The commander crossed his arms. Then explain. The SEAL leader exhaled slowly. There are certain people in the military who operate in environments most personnel never see. He glanced toward Ima briefly. They're trained to perform surgical medicine under live fire, to stabilize casualties in active combat zones, and occasionally, he paused, to remove threats when no one else can. The officer's tone hardened. You're suggesting this nurse is one of those operators? I'm not suggesting, the SEAL leader said calmly. I'm confirming. The commander frowned. I've never heard of anything like that. That's because programs like that don't appear in normal records. The younger SEAL finally spoke. Sir, the call sign Iron Medic. The commander looked confused. What does that mean? The SEAL leader turned the tablet around. On the screen appeared an old file photo. Desert background. Combat uniform. A younger version of the mask standing beside a field medical unit. Below the image was a classification stamp. Restricted archive. Call sign, Iron Medic. Special Operations Combat Medical Officer. The commander stared at the screen, then slowly looked back at the woman sitting calmly at the table. You were Special Operations? And Matt didn't answer. The SEAL leader did. She served in multiple classified deployments 10 years ago. The officer leaned forward. And then what happened? She left. What? Yes. The commander looked skeptical. You don't just walk away from a program like that. Most people don't, the SEAL leader replied. But she did. Silence settled across the room. The officer glanced back at the footage. 10 shots. 10 hits. He looked back at Emma. You neutralized a coordinated assault that our drone analysis says involved trained foreign contractors. She remained quiet. The officer shook his head slowly. And we were about to discipline you for it. The commander leaned back in his chair. Well, this complicates things. The SEAL leader spoke calmly. She saved this base. The officer nodded reluctantly. That much is clear. Outside the command trailer, a helicopter landed on the repaired section of runway. Its rotors roared against the night sky. A medical evacuation transport returning from the regional hospital. Inside the command trailer, the radio crackled. Update from the hospital, a voice reported. Surgery complete. Patient stable. The commander glanced toward Emma. That would be your husband. She stood quietly. May I go? The commander nodded slowly. Yes. She stepped outside into the freezing night air. Snow crunched beneath her boots as she walked toward the landing helicopter. The transport doors opened. Inside sat a flight medic finishing paperwork. He's stable, the medic said. Lost the leg below the knee, but he's strong. Emma nodded once, then climbed aboard. Her husband lay on the medical bed. Awake. Hell. But smiling faintly when he saw her. They told me what happened, he said quietly. She pulled a chair beside him. They told me the base held. He studied her face carefully. No, that's not what I meant. A long silence passed between them. I heard something else, he said softly. From the SEAL team. She didn't react. They called you something. Another silence. Then he spoke the name. Iron Medic. The helicopter cabin hummed softly around them. Emma stared at the floor for a moment. Then finally looked up. That was a long time ago. He nodded slowly. Oh, it was you. Yes? He reached for her hand. You never told me. She squeezed his fingers gently. Because I didn't want to live that life anymore. He studied her face again, then smiled faintly. Well, he gestured toward the snow-covered base outside the window. Today it saved all of us. And Matt didn't answer. She simply sat beside him while the helicopter prepared to lift off again. Outside, the SEAL team leader watched the aircraft. The younger operator stood beside him. Sir, the younger man said quietly. Command's already requesting a full report. The leader nodded. I will. What do we write? The SEAL leader glanced toward the helicopter where Emma sat beside her husband. Then he looked back at the frozen valley. We write the truth. The younger operator hesitated. And what's that? The leader's voice was calm. The base survived. He paused. Because a nurse refused to stand down. Morning returned slowly to the Arctic Valley. The storm clouds that had hung low over the base during the attack were gone now, leaving behind a pale blue sky that stretched across endless white terrain. Snow glowed under the early sunlight. For the first time in 2 days, the base felt calm again. Repair crews worked along the northern perimeter where the explosion had torn open the fence, Engineers replaced damaged sensors while soldiers hauled away the charred remains of the Humvee that had burned near the motor pool. Life on the installation was returning to its rhythm. But the story of what had happened there had already begun moving far beyond the valley. Inside the command trailer, 2 senior officers from regional headquarters sat across from the base commander reviewing the final report. A thick folder rested on the table. Drone footage, radio transcripts, after-action analysis, and one name highlighted repeatedly in the margins. The visiting nurse. One officer flipped through the reports slowly. 10 enemy operators neutralized, he said quietly. Overwatch positions eliminated, mortar team disabled. The other officer leaned back in his chair. All from a single firing position. The base commander nodded. Ness? The officer tapped the folder with one finger. And the individual responsible is currently listed in our personnel system as a temporary medical rotation nurse. The commander sighed. That's correct. The officer looked up. You knew who she was? Not until after the attack. The second officer spoke. The SEAL team confirmed her background. The commander nodded again. Former Special Operations Combat Medic. Call sign Iron Medic. Silence settled over the room. The officer closed the report. Well, he said finally. That explains the shooting. The commander folded his arms. Ness? But it also raises questions. The officer raised an eyebrow. Such as? Why someone with that history ended up working quietly in a hospital. The second officer shook his head. Some people leave those programs because they've seen enough. Outside the trailer, soldiers moved through the yard carrying supplies between buildings. Most of them had already heard the story. A nurse climbing the southern ridge. 10 precise shots. An ambush stopped. But Emma herself wasn't anywhere near the command center. She stood inside the small base clinic, checking the inventory of medical supplies. Bandages. Sutures. Antibiotics. Routine work. Across the room, a young mech watched her quietly. He had been one of the soldiers pinned behind the barricades during the attack. The one who had seen the sniper fire change the entire battle. You know, he said finally, people are talking about you. Imad didn't look up from the supply lists. People talk about everything. The medic hesitated. They're saying you used to be some kind of special operator. She placed a box of bandages on the shelf. People say lots of things. But is it true? She finally looked at him. Her expression wasn't angry. Just calm. It was a long time ago. The medic nodded slowly. Then smiled faintly. Well, I'm glad you were here. She returned to her work without answering. Across the base, a helicopter landed near the communications tower. The SEAL team leader stepped out first. He had returned briefly to deliver the final intelligence report. The younger operator followed him across the snow-covered yard. So that's it? The younger man asked. We just leave. The leader glanced toward the clinic building. That's what she wants. The younger operator frowned. She could come back, you know. To the program. To command operations. The leader shook his head. Oh, why not? Because she already made her choice. The younger man looked confused. What choice? The SEAL leader gestured toward the clinic window. Inside, Emma stood beside a patient explaining how to clean a wound properly. Her voice was calm. Patient. Is that a... She chose to heal people, the leader said quietly. Not hunt enemies. The younger operator watched her for a moment. But she can still do both. The leader nodded. Ness? But the difference is now she decides when. Later that afternoon, Emma boarded the same transport helicopter that had brought her to the base. Her husband sat beside her in the medical transport seat. The bandages around his leg were fresh. The space beneath the blanket where his lower leg had once been was empty. But his expression was calm. Rehabilitation would be long, difficult. But he was alive. And that mattered more than anything else. As the helicopter lifted off, the frozen base grew smaller beneath them. The radar tower shrank into the distance. The broken fence line barely visible from the air. Her husband glanced at her. "Command wanted to offer you something," he said. She looked at him. "A commendation. Maybe even a return to special operations." She smiled faintly. "And what did you tell them?" "I told them they should ask you." He paused. "So what will you say?" Emma looked out the helicopter window. The endless Arctic wilderness stretched below them like a white ocean. Quiet. Yes, all. For a moment she remembered the ridge, the rifle, the stillness before each shot. A life she had once lived. A life she had buried. Then she looked back at her husband. "At the hospital," she said softly, "there are 3 nurses in trauma care." He laughed quietly. "So that's your answer?" "Yes." He nodded. "Sounds like you." The helicopter continued south toward the distant military hospital. Toward rehabilitation. Toward recovery. Toward a quieter life. Months later, the Arctic attack would appear in classified reports and intelligence briefings. The official summary would read simply: "They successfully defended during coordinated assault." No medals would appear in public ceremonies. No headlines would mention the sniper on the southern ridge. But among the soldiers who had been there, among the SEAL operators who had seen the drone footage, the story traveled quietly. About a nurse who climbed a frozen ridge. About 10 precise shots that saved an entire base. About a call sign that had once carried weight across battlefields. "Iron Medic." Yet if someone ever asked Emma about it, she would only smile politely. Then she would return to the hospital floor, checking vitals, cleaning wounds, saving lives one patient at a time. Because true strength rarely announces itself. The strongest people are often the quiet ones, the ones who carry extraordinary histories without needing recognition. And sometimes, the person standing calmly beside a hospital bed might be someone who once held the line between life and death for far more people than anyone realizes. Heroes do not always wear medals. Sometimes, they wear a nurse's uniform. If this story moved you, remember that the people who save lives every day often carry sacrifices we never see. And if you had been on that frozen base that day, would you have recognized the hero standing quietly beside you? Let us know what you think. Like, subscribe, and comment what you would have done.